It gives the farmers an incentive to do these things on land. We all live in a catchment, and the solutions for Westport start at the source of the catchment up past Carrowbeg Lock. But she mentioned the Inishowen River Trust, and I know you were at the community's Care for Water last year, and they were there. Can you tell us something about the Inishowen River Trust? Do we need to set up a river trust to tap into? It's supposed to be increased funding through the nature restoration law was passed in the EU, and supposedly the funding streams now.
Yeah.
It's probably be easier to set up something like that now. What do you think?
Well, certainly, yeah, that's something that Westport supports, and I think lots of communities in the country do it in slightly different ways. Some use the Rivers Trust model, some use a catchment partnership model, and indeed some are tiny towns that just take it into their objectives to have a kind of a charter for their local river, and some are like Call, who are kind of a climate and biodiversity, and they have 3 pillars and water is one of them. I think there isn't a one size fits all. I think it's more about, I suppose, the intention that the community have. It could be a Rivers Trust and it could achieve the same thing through another type of entity. But I think the important thing is to decide that the community collectively want to take on custodianship of the river and promote that. In a catchment scale, like you say, because that's really the only effective way to manage a river is at a catchment scale. Yeah, and there definitely is plenty of funding around for supporting that kind of initiative. Yeah. And I think one thing we didn't mention, which is important to say, is that the river in the town here is what we would consider as heavily modified. That section of river, it's very far from what a river should look like in a natural state. It's kind of confined with walls, and it's over widened, and it's impounded by several weirs, and it's impounded all the way down to the sea. And so ecologically those things are negative, but also in terms of the aesthetic argument that people tend to disagree over, the river isn't in a position to manage itself naturally. And if you look at a wild river in Connemara or somewhere, you go back to Bundurka or Carniski, you'll see lovely wild rivers tumbling and twisting with native trees and nice vegetation, but and they manage themselves, in terms of erosion and deposition, and that's a biodiversity net positive. But in the town here, some of the discussion has been about weed and algal growth and deposition of substrate, and that's all probably happening because the function is gone in this part of the river. So I think that's the difficult thing. But the river has been like that for a long time, and there's a kind of a long established status quo and an expectation of how it looks, and that was something that was very fashionable in Victorian times. So that's part of I think the conversation to have is is there an appetite to do something to kind of rehabilitate this reach of the river here in a way that's aesthetically pleasing and ecologically sound.
So who would be who controls the funding, if there is funding for nature restoration laws? Is it Teagasc? Is it yourselves?
Well, we have funding streams for that kind of initiative, and I suppose it's something that could come under the auspices of One Westport if One Westport decided to have a branch or an arm that had a catchment focus, that would then filter into all the other interests in the town, because that's what it needs to be. It needs to be something with a river catchment focus, but that's also connected to the community, to the businesses, to the tourism interest, and so that you again build consensus through anything you want to push forward.
Tidy towns get it?
Tiny towns are not permitted to get that because they get state aid already, so that's one of the clauses in our catchment support fund. There is a government fund to support tiny towns. I don't know a lot about them, but there is, isn't there? So when we got that particular fund, that was one of the preclusions, because it can't fund something that they're already funding, unfortunately. But they could form another entity under One Westport, or a branch of One Westport, certainly.
Yes, I was going to say, from the perspective of CALL, Climate Action Lewisburg Locality, which is a CLG, it seems to me that as long as there is an entity of that kind, and One Westport would qualify for that, with the appetite and the interest in working on the rivers and biodiversity and so on, and then ideally someone with the capacity to write, and the time to write the funding bids, it seems to me that actually there is plenty of funding available at the moment. So Rivers Trusts are great, aren't they? But I don't think they're essential at this point to tapping into that.
No,
kind
and
of-
I mean, as I said, there are equivalent entities that basically function like Rivers Trust without being called a Rivers Trust. So, you know, the Rivers Trust is a kind of specific movement that has grown from the UK and it's been very, very successful. And some groups kind of decide to go that way, and other groups decide to just be a CLG. Like there are groups like Carrowbeg and Cumbio, and they have a water focus in their organisations, but they're not Rivers Trusts per se. But they do have CLG and charitable status, and they operate in a similar way, but they just have wider objectives. So it might be something, as I said, if one Westport is already a CLG, it would provide that structure, that legal structure that you would need to receive funding for catchment-based kind of activities and projects.